Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here. Happy Friday. The whirlwind of news that we got yesterday continued into the evening after the Model 3 Highland updates. We had pretty massive price decreases on the Model S and the Model X. Tesla's also cut the price on FSD, so we'll talk about that. We also have, of course, another day of reaction to Model 3 Highland and a couple of updates on that as well. So with the news of the price cuts today, Tesla finishing down 5%, so obviously tough to get a gauge for how much of that's impacted by Highland, how much of that is impacted by the S and the X price cuts, but nevertheless, Tesla down 5%. The NASDAQ barely finishing in the red today, but basically flat on the day today. So we're going to jump right into these price cuts. Very significant. So S and X decreased on the base price versions by 15 to 19% in total. The very short-lived standard range software limited vehicles that Tesla introduced 2 weeks ago are now gone forever. A very short-lived product for Tesla, which not surprising, even when those released, since we kind of figured out at that time that they were software limited. We talked even in that episode about how this was probably a test of some sort for Tesla. I think I had mentioned that maybe that was them trying to see if it was justifiable to then release or produce a version like that was not software limited, but rather actually had a smaller battery. So I'm not surprised to see a quick reaction after Tesla's sort of had that 2-week trial period now. I am a little bit surprised to see the prices cut this far, although we talked about the Model X kind of eventually moving in this direction because of the tax credit. So let's look at these prices. On the Model S, I guess we'll start with X since we're on this page here. The dual motor all-wheel drive opening price point version now starts at $79,990, and the S $5,000 cheaper than that at $74,990. The Model X Plaid $89,990, so by far the cheapest that the Plaid has ever been. So we'll focus on the X, and then I do want to look at our, of course, handy dandy price change table. But first on the X, and I know I'm covering it a little bit here. See if I can zoom in and get that into a visible range. There we go. The Model X, so of course now eligible for the $7,500 US federal tax credit, because for SUVs the price cap on that is $80,000 as the MSRP. So moving it to this price does move it into that eligible bucket, which is great. That should really help, in addition to the price cut here, keep the price much more affordable for buyers that are eligible. Of course, there are income restrictions, so especially for the type of vehicle that the S and the X, the price bands that those occupy, not all buyers are going to qualify for that from an income perspective, but some are, and that's going to help those buyers make this, a much more affordable vehicle, competitive with, what they might be cross-shopping with other vehicles, or even with something like the Model Y. So obviously a huge move for the Model X. While we're talking about the federal tax credit, Tesla, like they did say for the Model 3, also says on the Model X page here that reductions are likely after December 31st. So we've talked a bit about this. Right now it seems like Tesla might be relying on sort of a fleet level perspective on either battery materials or, whichever the other criteria is, I forget at this point. But for the two battery criteria that are required to be met, Tesla might be relying sort of on fleet level data right now, and some of that may change a little bit with Tesla's product lineup changes. So for the Model 3 and the Model X, it looks like this may be at least a little bit in doubt as those restrictions become a little bit more significant heading into next year. Now, Tesla might figure out a way around this, but at least for now, they are saying reductions likely after December 31st. So something to keep an eye on, and obviously creates a bit of urgency there on the X. Now, for the S, we talked about that, the prices. So same thing with the Plaid, that's $90,000 as well, or $89,990. So we'll just look at our price change table here. I know it's a little bit small, but hopefully that's at least a little legible for you guys. So no changes on the 3 and the Y, which I think, of course, internationally there are changes on the Model 3, and those prices have been increased. So we need to consider that when we're talking about margins, especially because presumably cost to produce the Model 3 has gone down. I would expect over time the Model 3 will, continue to decline from where it's starting out now, just initially after the refresh, but we should see margin improvements once production is ramped up on the Model 3. So that's important. Model Y not decreased here, although obviously Tesla is now selling more through inventory, so it's a little bit tougher to track these things. But for the S and the X, as we said, these are now 15 to 19% cheaper on the base versions. And then I think both Plaids are 18% cheaper, if I remember that math correctly. So one piece of context that this price chart brings us is where these started out after the refresh. So when Tesla immediately reduced, or right after Tesla introduced the refreshed Model S and X, The long-range version of those vehicles costs $79,990 for the S, $89,990 for the Model X, and this was basically 2 years ago, a little bit over 2 years ago now at this point. That happened in sort of Q1 of 2021. So we're now 2.5 years into that. The S is now starting at $5,000 cheaper. The X is now starting at $10,000 cheaper. So just 6 and 11% cheaper than when they were introduced back at that point in time. That's really not too big of a decline. Obviously, if you look compared to where they were at in 2022, as with all Tesla vehicles, we're seeing huge drops, $20,000 to $40,000 here for the S, and similar for the X, from sort of those peaks in, the beginning of 2022. I don't know if that was quite the peak, but significant declines from those values. But compared to when they were first introduced, at least on the base price versions, not really that crazy. And when you consider where interest rates have gone over that exact same period of time, it's, it kind of makes a lot of sense, because, these vehicles at 6 and 11% cheaper, once you calculate in the impact of interest rates, they're probably, the payments on those opening price point vehicles are probably even higher than they were post introduction. So although these are significant price cuts and really sudden, we've been talking for, probably at least a quarter now, maybe even a little bit longer than that, about how, S and X price cuts at some point were probably pretty likely. Of course, we saw the introduction of the standard range. And again, I think Tesla just kind of testing that out and just deciding to say, all right, well, we're just going to go for it. We're going to cut the prices, get the X below this level, and, start really moving some of these vehicles. So again, price points at the opening price point, not too crazy from where they started out. Obviously, I would strongly prefer if Tesla was able to sell all these vehicles at a much higher price. Obviously, you'd always, like that to be the case as an investor. You're generating more margin in that scenario. But I'm also glad that Tesla is willing to, continue to make what most companies would probably find to be difficult decisions, like a, significant price change like this, to be able to make those quickly and, continue to push forward on volume and all of that, the benefits that will bring over time as Tesla continues to scale. So obviously, wish it was a higher price. I wish there were a little more things that Tesla was doing to kind of, educate people. We've talked about that with advertising, of course, and Tesla's started to do a little bit of that. I think the budget that is going into these price cuts is probably worth at least evaluating a little bit more in terms of other ways that could be deployed. But obviously that's not how Elon feels that the company is really run. And I also think it's just, although it is important, I think the overemphasis on it does exist, in that, people overemphasize the effect of the business on the business today. But as we always talk about when the quarterly earnings come out, the business today is really not, not to diminish the importance of it, but it's not really all that important, whether Tesla's generating a few $1,000s extra on the S and the X right now, right? Like it's pretty inconsequential for where things end up. So those are kind of my thoughts on the price cuts, at least where we see them right now. Hopefully this, since this is so significant, hopefully this will kind of be the end of it. We'll see. We have seen Tesla cut prices, and then, as you can see, a lot of green on these charts, sort of found that price point and started to increase them again. And obviously, again, the inventory point here affects that a bit, but we'll see where things go from here. The Plaids we didn't talk quite as much about, so those are obviously significantly cheaper even when they were introduced, right? So 25% lower than the introductory price. Those at the high end of the range make more sense because, when they're first introduced, you're going to have those early adopters that kind of just have to have that, updated version, the highest performance vehicle. And that's great. And Tesla can earn, higher margins on that as they ramp the product line up and bring costs down. So it kind of supports that product ramp. But, 2.5 years in now, we should be pretty much through all that to where Tesla can now bring these down again. Would love if it were higher, but it's just kind of where things are at today. And the closer the price points between the long range and the Plaid, the more you're going to have people opt up into the Plaid. Because if you start drawing these price points out to $20,000, $30,000 difference, it just makes that opt up decision that much more difficult. So obviously these are still going to be higher margin versions. You still want people to kind of opt up into them. So again, we've got a mix of lower prices on S and X, but Model 3 higher volume vehicle. The S and the X are a relatively small part of the mix. That's not to say they're inconsequential to profitability, but their impact on profitability much lower than a vehicle like the Model 3. And like we said, there's been price increases on the Model 3. One quick note, in Canada, Tesla has also cut the price, and it is now, for the Model S at least, below $100,000 in Canadian, and that means that it can avoid the luxury vehicle tax, so it's a nice little boost there. That's only 20% on the amount of the price above $100,000, so I can't remember what the price was previously, but it is going to save at least a little bit there on luxury tax in Canada, so that'll be a nice boost as well. All right, and then for FSD, price is now $12,000. So of course, in the US, this was previously $15,000. Tesla's cut the price by 20% on FSD. This one, it's a little bit tricky. Of course, Elon has always said that the price of FSD is going to continue to increase as the capability of the software improves over time. And I think there's good logic behind that because it does become more valuable and presumably closer to sort of the end state where FSD is really worth, in reality, a lot more than what Tesla would be selling it for. So where the price has been for the last couple of years, it's been pretty clear that Tesla's not trying to sell a lot of these, right? The take rate we know is low, and it's a very expensive option. I think Tesla hasn't really cared too much because eventually they view this as getting turned on, and then people will opt in, and that will ultimately earn them more money than if they were to sell this license up front and then not be able to kind of collect more revenue from it later on once it really is more valuable. So that's kind of been the logic, at least from my perspective, and seemingly from the low take rate that Tesla's been okay with. Maybe now they're trying to drive the take rate up a little bit just as margins on the vehicles themselves become a little bit more compressed. They might be trying to gain back a little bit of that through a higher take rate on FSD. So they might be experimenting a bit just to see sort of what the clearing price on FSD is, to where that might start to drive a little bit more margin versus a higher price option. As we talk about everything mix related, you have to weigh the take rate, just like you compare a long range versus a plaid. You got to compare what the take rate on a $12,000 FSD versus $15,000 FSD would be, and see if that nets out as a positive in terms of the impact to gross profitability. So Tesla probably experimenting with that. I wouldn't honestly be too shocked if FSD price changes again relatively soon as Tesla evaluates that, but it'll be interesting to kind of follow. So I think that's a part of it. I also, as much as people are probably tired of hearing about it, I do think interest rates also affect this too. If you look at a $15,000 price for FSD being added to the vehicle at a 2% interest rate versus a 6 or 7% interest rate, I'm guessing they probably come out pretty similarly, sort of on the payment perspective, the monthly payment that equates to, just from those higher interest rates. So I think that's probably also at play with the reduction that we're seeing here. Now, personally, I think, I'd probably rather just keep it high and then lower the monthly subscription price with just kind of a note to make it clear to customers that over time that subscription price will probably increase. So no one, gets surprised when that eventually does happen. But I think that'd probably be a better way of doing it. But we'll see what Tesla, has in mind there. Again, wouldn't be too surprised to see it change. All right. Project Highland. So just a couple of things here. Robert Llewellyn of the Fully Charged Show did have a test drive of the Highland. So great to see that. He's a Model 3 owner, so we get some good perspective from him. He noted quite a few improvements throughout his drive. He said he just bought a 2023 Model 3 and he really wishes that instead he would have the Highland. He just liked it pretty significantly more than the current Model 3. So again, probably just a very quick test drive here, and probably would need a little bit more time for a comprehensive review, but good to hear some of those positive comments from him with this early test drive. I'm not sure. I think there maybe is a couple more out there, but overall, I think what we covered last night has, largely been pretty much all-encompassing of what we know so far on the Highland, which is really good. We talked yesterday about the range, how that wasn't totally clear because for the Model 3 in Australia, for example, the range was 629 kilometers for the updated Highland on the long-range version. Previously, that was 602, so it looked like a 4.5% increase. Some places were saying 5%, some places were saying 8%, some places were saying 12%. CarWow actually said 678 kilometers on the WLTP test cycle. What seems to be happening here, upon further investigation, Tesla doesn't seem to have the WLTP test cycle for the Aero wheels yet, because if we flip over from the Aero wheels here are called Photon, I couldn't remember that yesterday, but if we go from the Photon to the Nova wheels, which are the 19 inchers, the rated range still stays the same. So unless that's sort of a glitch in the configuration studio, there does seem to be a discrepancy here where obviously you would expect a pretty significantly higher range on the 18-inch aero wheels versus the 19-inch sort of non-aero wheels. So if what's happening here is that Tesla maybe doesn't have the official WLTP rating of 678 yet for the aero wheels, maybe that's just what they expected to come in at, and maybe that's the figure that CarWow had, then you're going from 602 to potentially 678, you'd be looking at a 12% increase on range in that scenario. So, we talked about in China, it looked like maybe a 5 to 9%. We're not sure exactly what the numbers before there were either. So right now, to me, it's looking like somewhere between 5 and 12%. And obviously those figures are going to are going to vary depending on which test cycle you're using, WLTP, CTLC, or EPA. So I don't want to get like too hung up on whether, what exact percent it is. And obviously those depend on the wheels as well. But long way of saying that it does seem at least plausible to me right now that it is more towards that maybe 8% or even a little bit more than that improvement, like we heard about specifically the efficiency numbers as well. So that is, I think, even more encouraging than maybe what it looked like yesterday based on what we were seeing in the design studio. So I wanted to share those thoughts as well. And then we do have a quick update on the Cybertruck. So I think this originated on TikTok, but Old Spice on the Cybertruck Owners Club posting a photo of the front trunk for the Cybertruck. Gives us a nice look, probably the nicest look that we have seen of it so far, at least in sort of the finished form. Obviously it looks very sizable. Not sure exactly how it'll compare to, like an R1T or a F-150 Lightning, but definitely probably the biggest front trunk that Tesla would be offering. And kind of an interesting detail that was noticed here. If you look really closely, you can see there's, what appears to be a little bit of an embossing that's happening there or something. They put together a nice GIF of this, which you can kind of see. It looks like it is sort of that Cybertruck logo word mark sort of embossed into the front trunk there. So just kind of a nice touch. We don't know if that'll make it into the production version, but interesting to see that, and definitely a good eye for whoever caught that. All right, that's pretty much it. Just a quick look at the calendar for next week. So, of course, in the US, we've got Labor Day. That means the NASDAQ will be closed. So, likely no episode on Monday unless we get some crazy stuff happening, which obviously could be the case. It's been kind of a crazy week here. But Labor Day on Monday, the rest of the week, of course, we do have economic reports, but otherwise should be relatively quiet, at least in terms of the calendar. Things can pop up, but just from a calendar perspective. All right, that'll wrap it up for today. That was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be. Maybe I was a little bit rambly today, so sorry if that was the case. But thank you all for tuning in, as always. And you can also find me on X at Tesla Podcast. And we'll see you on, I believe, Tuesday, September 5th for the next episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.